Chapter 5 Adios. With the alley princess paused at the top of the freeway, we looked back at the city. To the east was the faint, gloomy outline of downtown Minneapolis. The skyscrapers were dark, giant statues carved in iron. Below, the carless freeway was an empty river with a windswept concrete floor. I need you to run the sail, I said to my father. I glanced at my mother. My father kept looking at the ghostly city skyline. I wondered if he was thinking of jazz concerts he had played, of the other musicians in the Shawnee Kingston band. Sometimes I thought they were his real family. Me? He said suddenly. Sure, I answered. He shrugged. I'll give it a try. Nat was silent. She watched him. He crawled to the rear of the princess and looked at the ropes. The fabric rolled around the boom. How does this thing work? He asked. Just like a sailboat, same as the old Tonka Miss, only with wheels. No sweat. As he loosened the tie-down cords, he automatically turned his face to catch the breeze, test its angle. That was a good sign. I went up front and took the handlebars. I would steer us. Ready? He asked. I gave him a thumbs up. Now departing, Pier 7, I called. Nobody laughed. My father used to be a good sailor. In one motion, he ran up the fabric, its little rings jangled against the cable, and swung the boom sideways. Fabric caught the wind with a sharp ka-chunk sound. Air punched open the sail. The princess lurched forward. Whoa, my father exclaimed. He struggled against the rope. Momentarily, the princess heaved up on her front tire. Spill some air, I shouted. My father dumped half the wind just before we tipped. Then the princess righted herself with a jolt and swept down the ramp into the concrete valley. Everybody screamed as if we were on a roller coaster at the state fair. Within seconds, we were going close to 30 miles per hour. I clutched the handlebars like death, but the princess ran straight and true, just like I knew she would. Once onto the freeway, I let out a breath. My father, wedged in the left rear bay, worked the boom from a single rope around his forearm. The wind was perfect. He leaned outward partway to counterbalance the wind, and for an instant I flashed back to the good old days before the ash. My father had a real job then. He was a high school music teacher and was home weekends like other dads. We would sail all day on Lake Minnetonka, from island to island, angling around bays, tacking back and forth. When I was really small, about 4 or 5 years old, it hit me one day that we had sailed clear across the lake with a strong wind straight against us. I thought this was a miracle, that my father could sail against the wind by going sideways, and it was clear to me that dads were just for that, miracles. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. Miles, look out, my mother called. She pointed suddenly at an upcoming freeway overpass. The mast! It's not going to clear the overpass, I finished as we sped underneath. I didn't even look up. I had done my research. I knew every bridge and its height from here to Birch Bay. Standard freeway construction, a foot to spare, and then some, I called out. We skimmed along, leaving a silent, tumbling wake of pumice like waves on moonlit water. Wow, Sarah said to me. She couldn't help herself. She was actually impressed. Here and there along the vacant freeway, abandoned cars lay like roadkill. Wheels and hoods were ripped off, doors were gone, eaten away by scavengers. Beyond the skeleton hulks of cars, under the bridges and in the shrubbery on the side slopes of the banks, were tiny red eyes of campfires. They were not big blazes, but more like embers, little secret fires among the bushes where the dark shapes of homeless people lay. Homeless people. That was us, but not quite. At least we had someplace safe to go. Directly ahead, at pavement level, 2 men leaned against a concrete bridge column and passed a bottle. One of them took a long drink under his dust rag. His eyes closed as we sailed past. The other one jerked backward in surprise as we whooshed by. He began to wave an arm and point after us and jabber at his companion, But by the time the other man looked, we were long gone, like frosty breath on a winter night. But it was summer, July 5th, and warm for a change. We sailed on. I commanded the handlebars and my father the sail. The dark suburbs unwound behind us in a steady but thinning stream. Deep into the night, near 3 a.m., I was sleepy at the wheel until I saw, closing from the north, a Romulan attack vessel. I jerked, fully alert, but the hallucination kept coming. It had a massive, pointed iron mask and running lights that swept side to side and low to the ground. From the heavy rumble, I realized that it was a truck. Not just one truck. It was the leader of a convoy coming into the city. A huge steel nose, half battering ram and half plow, jutted up front. Iron wings rode just off the concrete and sparked down at times like an electric welder with irregular power. All that iron was to knock away debris or roadblocks thrown up by bandits. The trucks also wore metal wheel skirts that reached nearly to the pavement, these to prevent anyone from shooting out the tires. The lead truck swung a spotlight on us, and I could see the glint of a gun barrel in its light. But we were breaking no law, and the convoy rumbled on in a tumbling whirlwind of dust. Maybe its drivers thought the alley princess was a hallucination. Along about 4 in the morning, we reached open fields. The wind blew stronger and steadier here, and the princess picked up speed. My mother, I made sure she was strapped in, was asleep in the cargo bay. Sarah was a dark lump of luggage. The freeway ran straight north now, and my father had to hold the boom hard to the right in the stronger wind. The wheels hissed and kicked up dust like a garden hose spraying whitewater. To keep his balance and get maximum wind, my father hung out horizontally, barely inches above the pavement. I caught my breath. Concrete was not water, and he should at least be wearing a helmet and skateboarding elbows. But then again, he was doing fine. The image of him hanging out there was better than any photo I'd seen in any of his old sailing magazines. I wished that my mother and Sarah were awake to see him. I wished that I could tell him just how cool he looked right now, but I had all I could do to keep the front wheel steady. Toward the dawn, the wind faded as if chased by the light. The gray sky leaked blue, then yellow, then pink, then an orange that looked fluorescent, or else like a huge cone of molten lava pushing up from the fields and trees. Then the big moment. The rim of the sun broke above the horizon line like a giant asteroid rising, not falling, and when it hit the giant, pale lake of the sky, ripples of intense colors spread in slow motion waves. Like rainbows, the extra color at sunrise and sunset had a scientific explanation. Sulfur dioxide, the main gas emitted by the volcanoes, combined with oxygen and water to form sulfuric acid gas, which then condensed into fine droplets or aerosols, which then hung in the air and made haze. Still, it was beautiful. Huh? What? Sarah said with alarm. She started awake, blinking, confused, then her eyes widened as she saw the sunrise. Pretty, yes, I said softly. Wow, she murmured in her little girl voice. My mother was stirring too. She smiled at the sunrise, then turned quickly to me. You want me to take the driver's seat for a while? I could steer. My fingers ached from clenching the wheel, and I suddenly was tired in a major way. Sure, I answered. Carefully, by inching along on opposite sides of the mainframe, we changed positions. In the rear, my father remained at his post. He was ghostly gray from dust, an ancient sailor from another time. You need a break, Dad? I asked him. No, I'm good. The wind's flattening out. Doesn't take so much work now. Our speed had dropped considerably, but we still rolled along at a good leg kick skateboarding pace. Why don't you get some shut-eye miles? He said. His voice sounded momentarily like it used to, in the good old days. I didn't have to be asked twice. Sarah, without complaint, actually took a bicycle seat so I could stretch out in the luggage bay. My mother's little wireless television radio came on at low volume. Like most adults, she obsessed on the news, especially nowadays. News was like a drug for adults. They had to have it. But what good did it do, especially when it was all bad? Luckily, the whirring pavement beneath me muted the radio sounds, and as the concrete rushed on in a never ending stream, I felt my eyelids drooping. I woke to the sound of panting. The light was brighter now, a brilliant dry fog that stung my eyeballs. For a second, I didn't know where I was. Winds shifted, my father said. This is hard, Sarah groaned, pedaling and making a big show of being totally exhausted. I took a moment to savor the sight of my sister actually doing some work, then fished out my map. We're just north of Little Falls. We're on Highway 10 now, my mother said. How much longer do we have to pedal? Sarah asked. The answer was a sudden slap whack-a-whack. Chain off, I said, springing into action. Pull over, nice and slow. My father spilled the sails, my mother steered us neatly onto the shoulder. When we'd stopped, they glanced at each other. It must have been a marriage moment, as I called them. Something about working together. Good, because I have to pee anyway. Plus, I'm hungry, Sarah said. You kids' timing was always amazing, my mother replied. She looked up ahead at the highway to a cluster of buildings, including a tall Golden Arches sign. On our trips up north, you always woke up about here, just before we stopped for gas at McDonald's. It's probably closed and boarded up, like everything else, Sarah said, looking toward the far-off yellow arches. We climbed off and slapped dust from our clothes. There was a grove of short, shaggy pine trees, someone's Christmas tree plantation just off the expressway. My cabin was deep in the pines. I didn't want anybody sneaking up on me. I kept all my important stuff hidden. You can't trust nobody these days. Let's push the princess in here, out of sight, then walk, I said. After we secured the princess out of sight, which necessitated dropping the mast, we waited as my mother put on the vest. It was a backpack sewn under a smock from when she had us kids. Now the maternity blouse held all our money, papers, shot records, etc. As my mother shifted it over her belly, Sarah rolled her eyes. She thought it was embarrassing. My father thought it was funny. I thought it was clever, even brave of her. With the vest in place, she looked perfectly, naturally pregnant. Nothing, not a word from anyone, she warned us. Did we say anything? I asked. No, but you were about to. We trudged along the shoulder toward the Golden Arches. In the parking lot were several farm tractors, dust-free, plus a convoy of 6 tractor-trailers. Here we are, my mother said, back to civilization, so to speak. We quickened our pace. I was hungry, too. As we approached the parking lot, a large man with a shaved head and a tattered NWO t-shirt swung out of the nearest cab and stood on the running board. Clearly an unemployed pro wrestler, now he carried a major-looking assault rifle. Good morning, my mother said cheerfully. It's just us, the Swiss Family Robinson, Sarah said softly. I have to admit that on rare occasions she has a sense of humor, and she's really not dumb, just pathetic most of the time. Do not approach the trucks, the guard said, stiffening his back. He wore mirrored sunglasses. What a cliché, I thought, but that rifle was impressive. Just heading to the restaurant, my mother said pleasantly. It is open, yes? Why wouldn't it be, the guard growled. My mother flashed him a smile. Have a great day, she said. Under her breath, she added, that guy has clearly taken too many body slams. Inside, the place was full of farmer types and businessmen. There was a major pause as they gave us the twice over. We smiled. My mother waddled to the counter. Slowly, their conversation resumed, but I kept looking around. It was odd to see a restaurant full of people drinking coffee and eating eggs and pancakes like it was back in the 1990s. Order me a number 3, okay? Sarah said as she headed to the bathroom. Several men followed her with their eyes. Behind the counter, the greaseheads wore the usual short-sleeved, stupid uniforms with shiny name tags that said Sherry and Justin and Dave, assistant manager. Everybody had the usual perky smiles. Above the counter were the usual mug shots of burgers and drinks, though I noticed that the prices were blank. Maybe the sky's not falling after all, my mother said to my father as she looked around the place. He said something back that made her laugh. My parents, probably all parents, have coded language they've developed, and I can usually interpret it, but today I was too hungry to bother. It was just nice to see them together, talking. When we finished ordering, the cashier, Sherry, looked up brightly and said to my mother, "That will be $92.50. "Excuse me?" my mother asked. The clerk repeated the price. "Are you kidding?" my mother laughed. "Almost $100 for breakfast at McDonald's?" The clerk shrugged. Her smile slipped, and conversation died as people turned to stare. My mother glanced around at the full restaurant, then back to the clerk. "So tell me, is everyone in this town rich? How do all these people afford such prices?" "Well, actually, they don't," Sherry muttered. "What do you mean?" They live here." There was absolute silence in the restaurant. Sherry looked behind her for help. "Just pay," I whispered to my mother. "You mean you have 2 sets of prices?" my mother pressed. Dave, the assistant manager, stepped forward. "That's right, folks. One for local people, one for strangers." At the word strangers, the silence got even quieter. "Miles is right," my father said softly to my mother. "Just pay and we'll be on our way." My mother bit her lower lip and slapped down 5 $20 bills. "Here or to go?" the clerk asked. Her cheerful face was back. "Here," my mother said. "If we're going to pay over $90 for breakfast, at least we deserve a darn table." We ate and made sure we used plenty of syrup and catsup. My mother continued to fume over the prices, but the rest of us ate and ate. It was like we'd never had fast food before. We were sweaty by the time we finished pancakes and eggs, juice and milk and coffees. The man in the next booth watched us eat. He had a kindly round face and a seed corn cap tilted to one side. "You folks must have been hungry," he smiled. "You got that right," my mother said. "Passing through?" she answered. Passing through?" "That's right," she answered. "That's good," he said. His kindly smile slipped a bit. My mother raised one dark eyebrow. She didn't reply. "What I mean is, we got more and more people think they got to get out of the cities," the man said. "They think if they get themselves to a small town, other people will take care of them." Men around him nodded. "Nope, that wouldn't be us," my mother said, her voice picking up the edges of his speech, finding his own rhythms and bouncing them right back. "We're headed north. On vacation. Right, gang?" We all nodded pleasantly, then bent low to wipe our mouths. Outside, my father let out a long breath. "That was scary," Sarah said, looking over her shoulder. "We'd best keep moving," my father said, looking up at the sky. The light was grayer now and the air felt cooler. I looked over my shoulder and saw white, round faces staring at us through the windows of McDonald's. The truck convoy guard stood, motionless as we passed. I could feel his eyeballs moving sideways behind his mirrors. Back at the pine plantation, I took some time to get the chain back on and inspect the running gear. I didn't like the way the pumice had worn down the teeth on the main sprocket. The sharp points were rounded off a full 1/8 inch. I considered oiling the chain, but decided against it. The oil was picking up grit, and the grit was grinding down the metal points. I had 2 spare chains and a spare sprocket, but still the amount of wear worried me. "Everything okay, Motorhead?" Sarah asked. It was her way of apologizing for being occasionally pathetic. There was a chance she might turn into a decent teenager someday. 10-4, we're good to go." I hoisted the mainmast and locked it in place. Maybe in a previous life you were a trucker, Sarah said. Or a sailor, my father said. Mechanic, I think, my mother added. It was their way of thanking me, and under the dust mask I smiled. The wind is switching to the northwest, my father said. Cold front coming in. My father knew his weather. That always impressed me. Which means, my mother said, after stashing the vest, she went back to her regular slim shape. Just like sailing, means we may have to hunker in for a while somewhere and wait it out, he said. But not here, Sarah answered, looking over her shoulder toward the McDonald's. It's way too creepy. Up the road a ways. The Mississippi should be just ahead, I said. We pedaled briskly past the exit ramp and didn't look back. My father tried to tack left and right against the wind, but the freeway was not wide enough to make the angling effective. Pedaling was harder and harder. It feels like we're going uphill, Sarah panted. We are slightly, I said. We're following the river, which flows south. In fact, there's almost 500 feet of elevation drop from the headwaters to Minneapolis. Ask Mr. Science, Sarah said. Hey, I've done my homework. What have you done? Children, children, my mother said. It's the syrup, my father said to her. The post-McDonald's sugar burst, remember? He looked at her. All too well, she said. I could tell that she was smiling underneath her dust mask. A couple miles north of the interchange, where the highway angles northwest, the wind turned full against us. Let's pull up ahead by the river, I called. Nobody argued. When we stopped, I lowered her mast, and then we rolled the Princess off the road and carefully down by the bridge and the river. We lay on the dusty, grassy slope and got our breath. Above us, swallows fluttered and dipped through the bridge supports, annoyed at our presence. They had little mud nests tucked up under the massive concrete forms. So here we are, Sarah began. Good progress for one day, I said. Nobody said anything. How long are we going to be here? Sarah said, looking up at the dark concrete roof. For a while, until the wind shifts, I said. So what do we do while we're here? Sarah asked. Whatever, I said. My father lay fully back and closed his eyes. Soon my parents were dozing and Sarah was reading. I checked the map. We were way more than halfway, at least 90 miles away from home and 50 or less miles to go. Birch Bay, that was our name for it, a log cabin on Gull Lake. It had belonged to my grandparents, whom I never knew, and was surrounded by birch and pine trees. We went there every summer for several weeks when my father was a teacher. In the last few years, however, we had made it up there only a couple of weekends during the summer. Birch Bay was one of the reasons I had wanted to get my driver's license, so I could drive up to the cabin myself. There was an old garage with ancient tools, wood saws and planes and rasps and cutting chisels, and every summer I made a different little wooden boat. The cabin itself had a fieldstone fireplace and bunk beds in the loft. I loved it there. I didn't even mind taking naps, as long as I could sleep outside on the big screened porch. Birch Bay always felt like the safest place in the world. Unlike this gloomy spot under the freeway bridge, it was damp and smelled odd. Even the Mississippi River was siltier than I expected, as if someone not far upstream was rinsing a huge brush full of white latex paint. Still, there weren't so many dead fish drifting along now, not like in Minneapolis. Even as I thought that, I saw movement in the shallows. A carp nosed around the rocks, kissing them with rubbery lips. He was sucking at algae of some kind. I stooped low and tried to get closer for a better look, but he saw me and made a beeline. A fish line? Toward deep water. Ha ha, Sarah said, watching me. I sat down on a rock and flicked little pebbles into the water. After a while, Sarah said, You know, it's weird. What's weird? I said, without looking up. I'm reading this novel, but it's like our lives are suddenly way stranger than fiction. I looked up. I shrugged. We were silent. When we get to Birch Bay, we'll be fine, I said. She didn't reply. I think we've got plenty of money, I said softly, glancing at my parents. Even the way food costs, we'll be okay. And if the money runs out, she said. Her voice was suddenly not so tough. We'll eat fish, I said, pointing. The big old carp had eased back to the shallows just upstream. His dorsal fin poked out of the water and sent out ripples as he nuzzled the mossy rocks. I'm going to see if I can sneak up on him. Don't hurt him, Sarah said. I let out an annoyed sound and took 3 or 4 steps closer. I was about to take another when the mortar round landed. A skipping black and white mortar round that landed, pashoom, directly on the carp. Sarah shouted. I stumbled back, almost twisting my ankle. My parents jerked upright. A huge eagle had snatched the carp. My God, my mother cried. Water sprayed as the eagle fanned its wings. It had come in low and hard, its yellow talons outstretched like spears. The carp twisted and flopped wildly in the eagle's clutches, but he was a goner. The eagle tilted sideways and flapped its wide wings low over the water. The carp skipping and slapping across the surface as the eagle slowly gained altitude. Amazing, my father said as the eagle receded. Poor fish, my mother said as she watched him disappear. I could see that we had a ways to go before we became a hunting and gathering family. As everybody relaxed again, I couldn't. My mother turned on her little television, and I began to poke around the campsite. There was something about it I didn't like. Maybe it was the signs of previous campers. Broken glass, some McDonald's wrappers, the remains of a campfire that had blackened the concrete overhead. One area smelled bad. In the rocks was a smudgy white flower of toilet paper. Gross. Camping here was too predictable. I didn't like being this close to the freeway, plus anyone moving on or along the river would spot the princess right away. Nobody knew where I lived, not even that game warden. I used a different trail every time. In winters, sometimes I wore my snowshoes backwards. You can't trust anybody these days. Turn that stupid TV, will you? I said to my mother. She looked surprised, but obeyed. I thought of the carp. The lesson here was not to splash around with your fin out of the water.